The story of Baldwin V, Count of Hainaut, begins at Easter Vigil, 1168 at Valenciennes. He and his parents, Baldwin IV and Alex of Namur, had gathered with their daughters Yolande, the Countess of Soissons, Agnes, Lady of Coucy, and Loretta, whose husband had died and she was between marriages, for a special occasion, which was the knighting of the young Baldwin. Our chronicler, Gisbert de Mons, who is the biggest source for this time period in Hainaut, notes that this was an exceptional thing because it was unheard of that the son of a count would ever be knighted. This was at the time of the Middle Ages when the chivalric level of society was becoming more solidified. It was becoming increasingly harder for anyone to become a knight. Usually it would take a lot of wealth to attain a horse and armor, and maybe some elevation of status and you were good to go. Now even if one could attain this, it wouldn't mean you were actually a knight, because now it had to be bestowed on someone by a noble, and you also had to be of noble stock. And Baldwin had these, but it seems to have been that it had never happened before, maybe because it was unnecessary for the son of a count to do so, even though he did live that lifestyle. We know of, for example, Louis VI as a child was knighted by the Count of Ponthieu, which, the son of the king is knighted, then why not the son of a count in the north? I like to assume that he's probably just talking about Hainaut, and how just coincidentally, I suppose, there were no counts that were knighted. It is said that the young Baldwin didn't interest himself in hunting or other so-called boyish games, but that didn't stop him from being into armed conflicts, otherwise known as tournaments, which, despite interdicts and such, never fell in popularity except maybe around Crusader times, when knights were going east. Just after he was knighted in the spring of 1168, he went to Maastricht, probably crossing through the lands of Liège and Namur to participate in a tournament. These tournaments were not exactly what one would call safe, though, and one man named Walter of Hainaut even died there. When he came back to Valenciennes, where he had been knighted, he visited some new constructions on a palace there to see what was going on. He looked around and saw how it all was, and then, with his knights and father who was still in town, decided to get a higher vantage point to see everything from up high. Too many of them ended up stepping on a wooden beam that wasn't as sturdy as they thought, it snapped, and they all fell a good story or two to the ground below. The Count Baldwin IV broke a leg while his son only had a dislocated arm, but the other knights that were with them apparently had smashed bones. To make matters worse for the old count, his wife Alex died while he was in recovery. She had given 15 parcels of land to the priest of the Church of Saint Waudru in Mons in exchange for prayers for her soul. Once Baldwin was healed up, he sought out many more tournaments after his experience at the first one. One of these was announced by Count Philip of Flanders. Now usually in tournaments each county's men would fight as a team, and usually with the men of other counties on their team. Hainaut usually fought alongside Flanders and Vermandois, but there was a rivalry now brewing between the men of Flanders and Hainaut, so Baldwin was to fight with the French, meaning the royal domain, against Philip of Flanders and his men. In the tournament, one of Baldwin's household knights, Geoffroy Tulazne, hit the Count of Flanders square in the chest and knocked him out, it is said, with his lance, not couched nor over the arm, but in some other way that the chronicler doesn't actually specify, sadly. The Count keeled over on his horse as if dead, everyone rushing over to his side, but he recovered and was possibly even captured and released by one of the knights of Hainaut, but we don't know for sure. Around this time, Henry the Blind of Namur in Luxembourg, at about 55 years old, decided to marry Agnes, the daughter of Henry of Gelder. Agnes's sister, Yolande, had long before married Baldwin III of Hainaut. These two were fairly old at this point, but still in the business of producing an heir. This marriage meant that Baldwin was to further knit the kinship of Henry the Blind and Baldwin, who was already a viable heir through his mother Alex of Namur, Henry the Blind's sister. A year following his being dubbed a knight, Baldwin married Margaret of Flanders on Easter 1169. She had been previously married to Ralph II of Vermandois, who was a leper and unable to consummate the marriage as a result of his illness. The marriage was served as an alliance to cool the tension between Hainaut and Flanders, which was much needed. The Count of Hainaut would help the Count of Flanders against all enemies except the Bishop of Liège, who was the liege lord of the Count of Hainaut, since Baldwin II had sold his liege homage to the Prince Bishop, and Flanders would help Hainaut against all enemies except the King of France, his liege lord. The Count of Flanders also gave some money each year for the castle of Douai, which was hotly contested between the two for decades. This payment would soon stop and be reinstated in 1185, which we'll get to. Sometime else in 1169, Baldwin IV and his son went to help the Count of Namur, Henry the Blind, who actually wasn't blind yet, by the way, he'll lose his sight later, their new kin, against the Count of Louvain, apparently with 700 knights, but Gisbert seems to always have a habit of exaggerating numbers. of either side of conflicts, and he exaggerates quite drastically, actually. This was one of far too many conflicts where the Counts of Louvain, which are soon to be the Dukes of Brabant, and the Count of Namur, and Philip of Flanders. In April of 1170, a daughter of the young Baldwin was born named Isabella at Lille, who would go on to marry the King of France, Philip Augustus, in due time. Remember when I said Gisbert exaggerates his numbers? Here's another one of those times. In August of 1170 at Trazegny, there was a tournament held, to which Baldwin brought apparently 3,000 foot soldiers because of the animosity of Count Godfrey of Louvain, who had 30,000 men who arrived first, which made Baldwin call for a retreat once he saw them. But his men were surrounded by a forest, so they couldn't retreat and had to fight. Baldwin got off his horse and stood his ground, encouraging his men as they slaughtered 2,000 of the Count of Louvain's men and capturing 6,000 more, alone double the forces Baldwin is said to have brought. In July of 1171, Margaret gave birth to her first son, named Baldwin, at Valenciennes, where the city had been burning due to some fire that destroyed 4,000 homes. That Baldwin, by the way, is going to be the one who rules in Constantinople. Immediately, Baldwin got to negotiating marriages for his children. Philip of Flanders did the negotiating for whatever reason, maybe because he was older or because he was in the Kingdom of France, with Count Henry of Champagne, or maybe because he was older. The agreement was that Baldwin's son Baldwin would marry one of Henry's daughters, and Isabella would marry one of Henry's sons. Should either of the children die on either side before marriage, they were to be replaced by another. In the autumn of that year, Henry the Blind was held up by his own liegemen in Luxembourg Castle. Henry the Blind was the Count of both Namur and Luxembourg at the time, which is why he was there and not in Namur. Baldwin then showed up with 300 knights and 300 sergeants, which are non-knighted mounted horsemen. Remember the whole nobility thing? To liberate him. Baldwin during this liberation demolished the castle and then proceeded to chase Henry's oppressors all the way to Metz, plundering on his way there. Back home on November 8th of 1171, Count Baldwin IV died, making Baldwin V, Count of Hainaut. First things first, he settled some disputes among his nobles and enacted justice by introducing inquests into the judicial procedures, or at least making them the normative way to determine guilt, and making sure murder was punished with death, and that whoever maimed someone would likewise be maimed. On this channel, there will be more discussion about judicial procedure in the French royal domain specifically. This is one of those times where something the French did was done after it had been implemented elsewhere, like a financial bureau that already existed in Flanders, which would be replicated or emulated at the Temple Treasury in Paris, or the use of bailiffs, which Flanders and Normandy had been doing before the kings. Whoever did these crimes would be judged by the close family of the victim and the count himself. If a noble killed or injured a peasant, he would pay for it in limbs and could only re-enter the peace if the count and victim's family agreed. Anyone who refused to recognize his peace was to be disowned by his own kin. Since the peace was one of those kinds that was compelled to be sworn by all the count's men, it was actually sort of a peace of God, but one that hinged on the count and countly justice to keep it, and not of bishops. The new count received homage from his nobles and serfs, and he was very lavish in his spending in tournaments. He restored hereditary offices to their rightful heirs because they were mostly hereditary posts. He was generous to the poor and fed them and listened to the canonical hours and masses. However true these are, for surely there is some embellishment, they nonetheless depict the ideal count for Gisbert of Mons, the chronicler. On Christmas 1171, there were 500 knights at the court in Valenciennes, which, if you haven't noticed, was a favorite residence of the Counts of Hainaut, Mons taking over prominence in later times. The renowned Gilles de Saint-Aubert, one of the Count's personal companions, was the steward, preparing and directing the meals at court. After Christmas, he took 80 knights with him and began frequenting more tournaments. During Lent 1172, about 6 months after becoming the Count, he went to Liège to give his liege homage to the Prince Bishop Rudolph of Zähringen, who is actually his cousin. Baldwin's mother, Alexander Moore's sister, Clementia, thus Baldwin's aunt, had married Conrad of Zähringen, the Count, and had Rudolph the Bishop as a child. After Easter, Baldwin took 100 knights to Burgundy to go to tournaments to the south, but the Count of Nevers denied him and all other foreigners hospitality in his castle of Rougemont, but they sort of forced their way in and slept there anyways. Baldwin fought with only 5 of his men there, and fought at Rethel as well on the way back. At Pentecost, he made an alliance with Henry II of England. This would be a money fief, meaning Baldwin would receive a payment from the king in exchange for some service. These were starting to gain traction around this time because it didn't require alienation of lands or other goods. They were easier than that alternative, and they gave the Lord more freedom as to what service he wanted. This was also not liege homage, which was done by Baldwin to the Prince Bishop of Liège, but just an alliance. In other words, if in some hypothetical situation the Count of Anjou, and thus King of England, Henry II, went to war against Rudolph of Liège, it would be the latter that Baldwin would be obliged to defend and support, and not Henry. Baldwin received 100 marks of silver for the support, which he split among his men in exchange for homage to the English king. Meanwhile, the Count Henry III of Limbourg attacked Henry the Blind's land, so the latter asked for help from Baldwin, who went to help him again. Baldwin and Henry went to the castle of Hainaut, burned everything around it, and compelled Henry of Limbourg to make peace. Baldwin also had Henry of Nemours' nobles re-give their oaths of obedience to him that they had already given to him once, as the next Count of Nemours should die. Baldwin remained in Nemours an entire month, which he expected, by the way, to inherit eventually, and then he went home. At this point, Gisibert mentions many of the knights in Baldwin's retinue, including Walter of Fontaine, who was the son of the daughter of Baldwin III's wife, Yolande, who had remarried after her husband's death. The Walter that we're talking about here would be executed by the Count of Flanders at a later date for having an affair with his wife Elizabeth, being, yes, hung by his manhood in a latrine until either the fumes or the blood rushing to his head killed him. Tragic. At the very beginning of 1173, Baldwin had his widowed sister Loretta marry Bouchard of Montmorency. Their daughter would marry a certain Simon de Montfort, who would be the father of the Simon de Montfort of the Albigensian Crusade. A year later, there was another breakout of war between Henry II and his son Henry the Young King, who was aided by Louis VII. Philip of Flanders had done homage to the young king and decided to help him, while Baldwin, as we already saw, gave homage to the father Henry II. Philip went and invaded Driancourt either at the end of 1173 or beginning of 1174, where Matthew, Count of Boulogne, his brother, fighting on his side, received a mortal wound in that battle and died a few days later. Because Boulogne was still under some influence of the County of Flanders, if you saw previous videos on this channel, you might have known that Boulogne was a vassal of Flanders, and Flanders had some control over it, and that's how he was even allowed to be there in the first place, because he was allowed to rule there after he had done some nefarious things to get there. We can talk about that in a different video. The marriage between Matthew and the heiress of Boulogne, that was, in fact, forced by abduction, was illegitimized by the church anyways, but it didn't stop them, and, well, again, it didn't really stop him. She probably didn't have much of a say. And he still continued to act as count. From the annulment of their marriage in 1170 to his death around 1174, the beginning of the year. After the siege of Rouen in 1174, both sides made peace that September. Our Baldwin had tried to bring his lord, the King of England, some aid in that conflict, but was ambushed by some Flemish knights at Bapaume and Flanders on the way there, stopping him from participating. Before Baldwin left, he had left his wife, Countess Margaret, in charge of protecting the construction of a controversial castle, which, a new character in the story, the Lord Jacques d'Avesne, had asserted was in his lands, and Gisibert naturally tells us it wasn't. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. You be the judge. This Jacques d'Avesne is a recurring character in the story who would show himself to be a royal pain in the side of the count, but sometimes also his ally, his descendants even becoming Counts of Hainaut themselves. He first ordered her to stop the castle's construction, which she rejected, so he whipped up his men and went to attack. The Countess, knowing this, set up an army herself at Maubeuge, and, leading it herself, prepared for battle. The dejected Baldwin was coming back from Bapaume at the ambush, and just at the right time, too, because he was able to join forces with his wife, and Jacques d'Avesne sued for peace as soon as he could. At this time, the valiant knight Gilles de Saint-Aubert was sick and languishing, so Baldwin went to visit him out of friendship. The idea of the Germanic warband leader had not faded by the late 12th century. The Count's household lights were to be treated as his family in a sense of comradeship. In fact, Baldwin and Gilles were related. When Baldwin III had died, his wife Yolande remarried and had a daughter named Bertha, whom Gilles married, making him Baldwin something like a step-cousin-in-law once removed. Any genealogists out there, please help me out. Gilles de Saint-Aubert had once had a castle which he held as an allied, that is, from no one else, and Baldwin made it so that he held it from him, to give him more security. The castle, called Bussigny, was acquired from Gilles' second wife, who had inherited it from her father, Gilles de Champs, who has a sort of knightly tale written about him. It's on Google Books, and it's in 17th century French dialect, if you want to read it. I haven't yet. Gilles de Saint-Aubert recovered from his illness, and on Christmas received the castle, and in the same way the town of Berlaymont in Fief then went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Around Easter of 1174, the bishop-elect of Cambrai, Peter, was convinced by his brother, Count Philip, to leave his post and become a knight. So far you have Peter is the brother of Count Philip, and Matthew of Boulogne, who had just died, was also his brother, and so yeah, Peter's the next one. We can imagine this choice to get his brother, the bishop-elect, to become a knight was maybe had something to do with his other brother dying. So he did, and married the daughter of the Count of Nevers, and the two had a daughter who would marry Robert of Vavrin, the Vavrin family often occupying the position of steward at the Flemish court. The clerk Robert from Chartres, provost of almost every church in Flanders and made rich from it from just a poor clerk before, was elected as new bishop of Cambrai, and at Brabant received the regalia from Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who was there at the time, and was given the temporal regalia to bishops. For his way back, he needed to either cross Avesnes or Hainaut, and didn't really feel safe with Avesnes, so he asked Baldwin V for safe passage through his county. He was given an escort and began to cross by the castle of Condé, which belonged to Jacques d'Avesnes, where some of his men came out, ambushed, and murdered the new bishop and his escort on the bridge. In retaliation, as this was against the count's honor, who was in charge of keeping the bishop safe, he had Condé burned. Count Philip of Flanders took back a few castles as well in Vermandois, destroying the castle of Guise. Sigebert of Gembloux says that, in his chronicle, that Jacques d'Avesnes cleared himself of the murder by an oath in court, so you can be the judge of what really happened. Around Christmas of that year, 1174, Gilles de Saint-Aubert, who had received the castle of Bussigny and Berlaymont and Fief from the count, like I had said, recovered and went to Jerusalem, but ended up dying on the way there. In August 1175, a tournament was called by the knights and Count of Champagne to challenge those of Hainaut, seen by our chroniclers as proud and arrogant, at Bresnes and Soissons, two towns next to each other. Baldwin arrived at Bresnes and waited in a vineyard for a challenger all day, but they didn't come, and by evening his men were telling him to retreat and go to Soissons out of caution, but he refused. Only when night fell and the moon was shining overhead did he and his men begin moving to Soissons after all, where they were targeted from behind by the French and Champenois, who were in Bresnes. So he and his men turned around and attacked, killing and drowning and capturing many of the foot soldiers that night. At Easter 1176, Jacques d'Avesnes had been complaining and trying to get Condé back, so Baldwin asked his men, some of the nobles and affiliated Jacques himself, what to do, and they said he should have no authority over the castle unless he received it from the count. So Baldwin attacked the lands of Avesnes by cutting down a path in the forest dozens of feet wide to reach Jacques, who did not dare engage him, and agreed to give up the castle of Condé, which Baldwin destroyed, but he gave back the town. In fall of 1176, Philip and Baldwin worked together against Jacques to restore castles to Philip. Many were returned to Jacques later on, though. In 1177, Count Philip went on a pilgrimage, so he had his nobles gather at Lee and recognized as his heir, Count Baldwin, since he had no sons, and his brothers Peter, the renegade bishop-elect, and Matthew, the former Count of Boulogne, were both dead. The count was even asked to be regent in Jerusalem for Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, and refused, and did not make a campaign against Egypt either. In 1177, the bishop, Lord of Cambrai, who had been elected and consecrated after the other debacle, died. So Baldwin pushed for his cousin Geoffroy de Tosny to be elected, while one of Baldwin's liege vassals, named Hugues was pushing for his brother Peter, an archdeacon of Cambrai, to be elected instead. Instead of these, Roger of Vavrin asked for help from Baldwin, and it worked, and he was elected, and he would die at Acre in the Third Crusade among many nobles and bishops. In 1177, the Bishop of Laon had attacked those who had made a commune against him, the communes of Soissons and Veilly. Some of Baldwin's men, like Jacques d'Avesnes and Renaud of Rozoy, were at the bishop's side. They crushed the people waiting in defense at those towns, but made Louis VII furious, so he went to their lands and began pillaging. They asked Baldwin for help, so he sent apparently 700 knights and 60,000 armed men, definitely not true, to defend against the king, but the king turned back and didn't fight this force. Still in 1177, Baldwin went to 2 tournaments, numerically inferior, and still won. He even captured a few knights like Matthew of Beaumont, one of the kin of Philip of Flanders, his sister-in-law's son, and even Raoul of Clermont, Baldwin's brother-in-law, at his own castle. Later in 1177, Count Philip of Flanders returned home from the pilgrimage. Around that time, Baldwin's sister, after a long time as a widow, married Count Hugh IV of Saint-Pol, and they had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Eustacia, the later marrying John, a castellan of Bruges. The Sunday after the Ascension, 1178, Baldwin went to Troyes with Henry the Count Palatinate to reaffirm the previously affirmed double marriage agreements between him and Champagne for each of their 2 children. In autumn of 1178, the half-brother of Baldwin V, Gerard, got sick and died and was buried at Mons. On All Saints 1179, Philip of Flanders at his request, Baldwin went to the coronation and anointing of Philip Augustus. Baldwin brought 80 knights with him. Count Philip, as the highest peer of France, held the royal sword at the coronation. At a nearby tournament, he captured Henry, Count of Bar, cousin of King Philip II, because his mother was Agnes of Champagne, sister of Adele, Philip's mother. Henry of Bar was then brought to Valenciennes and released. Despite being apparent outlets for aggression and exciting events, tournaments did have real stakes, like being taken prisoner in this case. Still in 1179, the issue of the Bishop Roger of Laon having violently suppressed the communal movement in his cities had to be resolved. He had been accused before Pope Alexander III and had to swear by oath that he had not killed anyone with his own hands, and that the lives lost were beneficial to the church. He asked Baldwin for help to talk to the very new King Philip to vouch for him, but they said it would take place on the 8th day of Christmas, January 1st. He would purge himself of his crimes. The king and queen welcomed Baldwin nicely, and he spent Christmas that year at Saint-Denis and arranged for the founding of a new town called Forest in Belgium that would belong to the count, perhaps with some influence of Saint-Denis there. On the awaited day, Baldwin traveled to Meaux to see the congregation of the Bishop of Laon, who was helped by the bishops of Arras, Cambrai, and Noyon. Later in 1179, when Isabella wanted to honor the previous oath of her father to Henry of Champagne regarding future marriages, she was sought out by Philip II of France. Philip of Flanders, who was brokering this, and Raoul of Clermont and some French councillors came to Mons to meet with Baldwin and Margaret and stayed for 3 days. Baldwin didn't want it to happen either, but Philip of Flanders' opinion prevailed, and he took Isabella with him, and it was arranged that she would bring as dowry not any land of her own father, but of Philip, bringing Arras, Saint-Omer, Aire, and Hesdin, in other words, Artois, which would be inherited by her son, and should she not have one, then Artois would devolve to the County of Hainaut, just like the County of Flanders was designated to. This is why it is said that Baldwin and his own were disappointed that some of Flanders would be inherited by the King of France instead of to himself at Philip's death. On the 8th day of Easter 1180 at Bapaume, at one of the castles of the Count of Flanders, Philip and Isabella were married. A few days later at Saint-Denis, Isabella was crowned Queen of France. Later in 1180, when King Philip had wanted to go to Auvergne, he asked Baldwin for an escort, and he gave one of 3,000 knights at his own expense, but didn't end up going, so they returned. Baldwin also attended some of the meetings with Philip of Flanders between Henry II and Philip II. In the fall of 1180, Count Philip and Baldwin's brother-in-law Raoul of Coucy were at war, so Philip called on Baldwin as ally to help. He sent 100 knights and 100 of what he called mounted men-at-arms, again the difference between knights and mounted men-at-arms being a social thing, and they went to help. In 1181, Count Henry of Champagne died, so the Bishop of France, Guillaume, brokered a renewal of oath between Baldwin and the wife and siblings of the late Henry to keep the prior marriage agreement. The first daughter of Baldwin had gone to the King of France, sure, but there was still something here to salvage. They decided here that Yolande, another daughter of Baldwin, would marry Henry, the young son of the late Henry, and that Baldwin's son, Baldwin, would marry that young Henry's sister, Mary. Any death would result in that child obviously being replaced by the other. Each side had guarantors, like William of Fontaine and Walter of Wavrin, for Baldwin, and the Duke of Burgundy, the Count de Bar, the widowed Queen Mother of France, and the Archbishop of France for the Champenois side. In 1181, the Provost of Douai, Gerard, had gotten into a conflict with his cousin, a knight, Bernard Roucourt, and killed him. Baldwin, returning from a tournament, heard of this and went to settle the score. He went and burned some of his houses in the fortress of Ostravant and occupied his possessions with his own knights. Gerard's nephew, Guillaume de Roux, pushed the struggle to a new level, killing a servant of Baldwin, to which he retaliated by going to Roux and burning the whole town to the ground and forcing William's family and friends to renounce him entirely, non-negotiably. He had avenged his kin, who was clearly in the wrong. He had struck Baldwin where it hurt. To him, burning the whole town where people of all types resided was satisfaction for such an affront. Such was the medieval times. And I think, actually, the Roux family might have been related to Baldwin. I forget how many generations back, but I think they were one of the other cousins. In July of 1181, Philip of Flanders went up against Baldwin's brother-in-law, Raoul of Coucy, and asked for Baldwin's help since they were both in an alliance. Giselbert says Baldwin brought 400 knights and 60,000 men, and says Philip brought 1,000 knights and, get this, 200,000 men. Yeah, we're talking like half Napoleonic army sizes here. But some French envoys and Baldwin were able to negotiate a peace. Sometimes you really question Giselbert's sanity, huh? Immediately, Baldwin returned and went straight to help his uncle Henry the Blind of Namur, who was fighting someone, which isn't actually specified, and they besieged the castle of Rochefort and negotiated a peace with more victories. Then there was some conflict between King Philip and Count Philip, which was strange since they had been getting along so well apparently, especially with the whole arranging the king's marriage and all that, but they still hurried to fight each other. Count Philip took advantage of this to reclaim the castle of Breteuil from Raoul of Clermont, which he had held from the Count of Flanders. Philip of France helped Raoul, while Baldwin had to help Count Philip, for their alliance, so he brought 220 knights and 110 mounted men at arms to fight his own son-in-law, the King of France. Count Philip then went to Noyon and burnt it down on the Friday before Advent. Then he and Baldwin went to Montdidier. Baldwin sent about half of his forces home to guard his lands since the war was going to drag on. King Philip had assembled his army at Senlis and armed other strategic points, planning to attack Valois, a possession of Count Philip, after the partitions. So Count Philip and Baldwin invaded all the way to Dammartin-en-Goële, just northeast of Paris, striking fear into the Parisians. They went back now, Count Philip telling Baldwin to stay at the castle of Montdidier to keep guard. Philip went to take on other castles while Baldwin took down the castle of the Bishop of Beauvais and pillaged the lands around the coveted Breteuil castle. King Philip had Henry the young king come with 600 knights to fight Count Philip. Knowing this, Philip, clearly commanding operations of both himself and Baldwin, ordered Baldwin to come to him at Duroc Castle, where he tried making a dangerous river crossing along the way. Count Philip called in more support from his lands, and Baldwin spent the night at Choisy, then came to Crepy, which Philip gave to him all the resources of the town for his soldiers and horses. Philip entrusted the first battle to Baldwin, and he gave his standard or battle flag to a certain Hugues de Croix. But since Baldwin took so long, and Count Philip and King Philip had been building their forces near each other for 2 days, he sent Baldwin back to Montdidier to guard there instead. Henry of Louvain, son of Duke Godfrey, showed up at Philip's expense with 30 knights and mounted sergeants to help him. Then Christmas came close, which means it was time for a truce until the 8th day of Epiphany. Baldwin decided to go home after 5 weeks of fighting King Philip. On the indicated day, the war continued, so Philip got Baldwin to come back, and he came with 80 knights. He went to Montdidier again, and fed his men and troops at a nearby town called Faverolles. Philip of Flanders took a rest at Montdidier, while Baldwin went out and pillaged all the way to Compiègne and Beauvais. When Lent came, they made peace. During Lent of 1182, Elizabeth of Vermandois, the Countess of Flanders, wife of Philip, died. Count Philip was distraught in danger of losing Vermandois, which he was supposed to receive a part of from what she had brought to the marriage. He called Baldwin to come visit him and give him counsel, while Philip was preparing to invade Valois. Baldwin told him to send troops to Saint-Quentin, and he himself sent messengers back to Hainaut telling them to meet him there. There was then a meeting between Baldwin, Philip, and Henry II and Henry III, and some counselors of King Philip, but to have a meeting with the king between Senlis and Crepy, which took place around Easter 1182, mediated by Henry II, Guillaume of France, Count Stephen and Thibault of Champagne, the Count of Burgundy, and Baldwin himself. In the deal, 14,000 pounds of silver would be given as a relief in order to maintain Vermandois and Valois, but Count Philip, out of generosity, gave Valois to Eleanor of Beaumont, his sister-in-law. This is the Treaty of La Grange Saint-Arnaud, which would ultimately only be a temporary solution. Count Philip was allowed to claim Vermandois the rest of his life, but it was the king who effectively ruled there. This is one of those scenarios early on in Philip's reign where he was very good with monetary policy and provostships, and he was more focused on getting more money, it seems, than actually gaining more land. You can see that with like his policy on the Jews and taxation and all that kind of stuff. See my other series for that. In autumn of that year, 1182, Baldwin was back to tourneying at Asch. I don't know how to say that. Baldwin was at a tournament where the Duke of Louvain was too. When Baldwin and his men were watching the spectacle, the Duke's men stole Baldwin's harness as well as some small horses and garments. Baldwin demanded it back immediately when he found out, and only half was returned, Henry saying he'd give back the rest a little later. Then Henry attacked the castle in Brabant that belonged to Baldwin. In retaliation, Baldwin attacked the castle of Tubize at Braine-le-Comte, supplied it and fortified it much stronger than it was, assembled a great army of the best knights he could find, many already mentioned in this story, but also the Count of Saint-Pol and the Count of Rethel, Raoul of Coucy, Count Raoul of Soissons, and his brother John, Lord of Nesle, the Lord of Lens, and his son. This next part's a bit confusing, but try to hold on. Now, Baldwin had a castle that was held from him by a certain Walter of Lens. This castle was held from Walter of Lens by Goswin of Enghien, and Goswin, who, owning all the town of Lembec, had given this castle of Lembec to Baldwin in pledge. Baldwin wanted to fortify the castle and town too, but it was part of St. Gertrude of Nivelles, which wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for Godfrey of Louvain claiming to be the patron saint and thus the property caretaker in a sense, similar to Baldwin's lineage with St. Waudru or France and Saint-Denis. So Godfrey and his son, Henry, made an army against Baldwin. Baldwin asked Philip of Flanders for help, who showed up and made peace to last over Advent and Christmas until the 8th day of Epiphany. During that time of peace, Baldwin had a meeting with his men and discussed their service to him, and he went to a tournament not to fight but to recruit men for his upcoming conflict with Godfrey and Henry of Louvain, Brabant. Godfrey at this time had gone on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, so when the time of the truce had finished, Baldwin and his men went to Lembec, where Philip said to stand down until Godfrey returned from the pilgrimage, since it wasn't listed to attack the lands of someone on a pilgrimage or crusade. Baldwin really did not want to, but he ultimately had to relent so as not to lose favor with Count Philip, whose support and alliance was valuable, and Archbishop Pilgrim of Cologne made the truce between them. In the winter of 1182, Henry the Blind of Namur, who was already blind in one eye now for a while, finally lost sight in the other, so Baldwin went right away to visit his uncle. He had the knights, nobles, and burgesses reaffirm their securities to him. Probably in early 1183, Baldwin sent an emissary to Frederick the Emperor Barbarossa to ask about the succession to Namur, because it was an imperial territory. The emperor sent a message back to Baldwin asking him to meet him in person, so he went with his best knights and was confirmed in what he wanted, and invited to both court and a tournament, which he went to both. Back home still in 1183, there had been a council at Senlis, where, as Gisdebert says, evil plans were made to make a divorce between Philip II and Isabel. The English translator on JSTOR of Gisdebert's Chronicle makes a good point in the footnotes that it was probably to retaliate against Philip of Flanders for influencing the king so much while he was still a youth, and maybe to get Baldwin to defend his daughter by cozying up to the king, thus positioning himself against the Count of Flanders, meaning this was only a bluff. And it is true that the Count of Flanders did have quite a lot of excessive control over the king in his first years. Either way, many nobles had been there, like Henry of France, the Counts of Champagne, Burgundy, and Clermont, and Philip had also not yet even consummated his marriage with Isabella because she was 5 years younger than him. On the day of the council, to decide the divorce, Isabella went out barefoot and in rough garments to the church just to pray to God to not let her be forsaken by the king her husband, and maybe to gather sympathy, and she did pretty quickly because people were yelling at the palace telling the king to take her back. So for some reason, she was actively liked by her subjects. Some of King Philip's cousins and uncles told him to hold back and not do this, answering her prayers. Around Easter 1184, there was a meeting between Henry II, Philip of Flanders, and some counts of the Grandmont order, who were isolationists and lived in the woods as hermits in the forest near Rouen, and Baldwin and Jacques d'Avesne accompanied Philip. Henry II was asking on behalf of King Philip if Count Philip would give up 2 castles in Vermandois, and the rest of Vermandois be confirmed in Philip's possession as long as he lived. which Philip agreed to, but Jacques d'Avesne said if he gave up even an inch of Vermandois, he would cast aside his homage to Count Philip. So Count Philip rejected the idea and went home with the matter unresolved. Baldwin then visited with King Philip at Béthisy, but not much happened. Then he met his daughter, whom he hadn't seen for a while, at Pontoise, who asked him in tears to have pity on her and work with her husband, the king, to repair the damage from the wars on account of Philip of Flanders. So Baldwin would say he would do for them what he could as long as it didn't go against his homage, namely with the Count of Flanders, his alliance, and with his liege homage to the Bishop of Liège. Some of Count Philip's men heard about this meeting and misconstrued it, saying that Baldwin had actually made an alliance with the king against the Count. So they told him that, and the Count believed it, so he was already suspicious of Baldwin and irritated with him. But Baldwin didn't even know, so it's sort of, bit of theater here we have, with a sort of passive-aggressive Count Philip of Flanders, who's mistrustful of his former ally Baldwin, who has no idea that something might be wrong between them. And we'll have to see how that goes next time, because this video is horribly long, so stay tuned for part 2 if you're actually still here. Thanks for listening, and goodbye. Till next time.